Welcome to our channel. In this special multi-part series, we unravel the life of one of history's most infamous figures. We move beyond the headlines to present a detailed narrative of Harvey Oswald, exploring the man, the myths, and the moments that led to November 22, 1963. Harvey Oswald, a definitive narrative of the man behind the assassination. Part 1. The Formative Years. A portrait of the boy. The story of Harvey Oswald begins not with a bang, but with a void, the profound absence of a father. Born in the old French hospital in New Orleans, Louisiana on October 18, 1939, Lee was the third son of Marguerite Frances Claverie and Robert Edward Lee Oswald. His father, an insurance premium collector and a man Lee would never know, succumbed to a massive heart attack 2 months before his birth, casting a long shadow over the family's future. Marguerite, a woman described by those who knew her as domineering, self-pitying, and prone to grandiose fantasies, was left to raise 3 boys, John, Robert, and the newborn Lee, on her own. This sudden widowhood and the ensuing financial precarity would become the defining features of Lee's earliest years, setting a pattern of instability and emotional turmoil that would follow him for the rest of his short, tumultuous life. The absence of a paternal figure was more than just a missing seat at the dinner table. It was a fundamental lack of grounding, a missing anchor in the stormy seas of a chaotic childhood from the outset. Marguerite's parenting was erratic and colored by her own deep-seated insecurities and a desperate need for attention. She moved the family constantly, chasing fleeting opportunities and fleeing perceived slights. Before Lee turned 18, he would live in more than 20 different homes and attend a dozen different schools. This nomadic existence prevented him from forming any lasting friendships or deep roots in any community. He was perpetually the new kid, the outsider looking in, a status that likely exacerbated a natural inclination toward introversion and suspicion. The family's financial situation was a constant source of stress. Marguerite took on a series of low-paying jobs, from hosiery shop manager to telephone operator. But her volatile personality often led to conflicts with employers and frequent dismissals. She saw herself as a victim of circumstance, a noble, struggling mother beset by an uncaring world, a narrative she relentlessly impressed upon her youngest son. This worldview, a potent cocktail of grievance and self-importance, was absorbed by Lee, who began to see the world through the same distorted lens, a place where his own failures were always someone else's fault. The lack of stability took a formal toll when, in 1942, Marguerite, overwhelmed and unable to cope, placed her 3 sons in the Evangelical Lutheran Bethlehem Orphans Home in New Orleans. Lee was just 3 years old, while his older brothers, Robert and John, could later recall some aspects of their time there. For Lee, it was an experience shrouded in the mists of early childhood, yet its impact was indelible. For over a year, the orphanage was his world, a structured institutional environment starkly different from the chaotic orbit of his mother. Though not an abusive environment in the physical sense, it was emotionally sterile. The absence of a consistent, loving maternal figure was now formalized, replaced by the detached care of staff members responsible for dozens of other children. It was here that Lee's burgeoning personality began to take shape, molded by a sense of abandonment and a deep, unarticulated anger. He became known as a withdrawn and solitary child, prone to sudden, inexplicable tantrums. This was the first of several institutional settings that would mark his life, each one reinforcing his isolation and his growing distrust of authority. When Marguerite eventually removed the boys from the orphanage, the pattern of constant upheaval resumed. She married Edwin Echtel in 1945, a union that brought a brief flicker of stability and a move to Fort Worth, Texas. For a moment, it seemed Lee might have a father figure, but Echtel was a distant, often traveling electrical engineer, and the marriage was fraught with tension. Marguerite's relationship with her new husband was as turbulent as her relationship with the world, and they divorced after less than 3 years. Lee, who had reportedly grown somewhat fond of Echtel, was once again left with a sense of loss and betrayal. The family's financial and emotional instability only deepened. It was during this period, in his early school years, that teachers and counselors began to formally note his behavioral problems. He was assessed as being emotionally disturbed, a personality pattern disturbance characterized by vivid fantasy life, turning away from reality. He was socially withdrawn, preferring the company of books to people, yet possessed a volatile temper that could erupt with little provocation. The seeds of the man who would later lash out at the world were being sown in the barren soil of a neglected and chaotic childhood. Part 2. Adolescence and Isolation. The making of a malcontent. The transition from childhood to adolescence is rarely smooth, but for Harvey Oswald, it was a period of profound and escalating turmoil. The move to New York City in August 1952, when Lee was on the cusp of 13, marked a significant downturn in his already troubled life. He and his mother, Marguerite, settled in a cramped apartment in the Bronx, a world away from the more sprawling landscapes of Texas and Louisiana. The anonymity of the massive city seemed to swallow him whole, amplifying his feelings of insignificance and isolation. Enrolled at a junior high school in a rough neighborhood, Lee's attendance became sporadic at best. He was truant more often than he was in class, choosing instead to wander the city's streets, ride the subway, or lose himself in the cavernous halls of the public library in the American Museum of Natural History. This was not the truancy of a boy seeking adventure with friends. It was the act of a solitary soul retreating from a world he found hostile and incomprehensible. His persistent truancy brought him to the attention of the city's authorities. He was picked up and taken to Youth House, a remand center for troubled children, for psychiatric observation. It was here, in April 1953, that he underwent his most thorough psychological evaluation to date. The chief psychiatrist, Dr. Renatus Hartogs, painted a disturbing and prescient portrait of the young teenager. He described Lee as having a personality pattern, disturbance with schizoid features and passive-aggressive tendencies. Hartogs noted that Lee was deeply withdrawn, consumed by a rich fantasy life where he held power and control, a stark contrast to his powerless reality. He saw his mother as the omnipresent and omnipotent force in his life, but felt profoundly detached from her and everyone else. The psychiatrist observed a boy who was emotionally frozen, starved for affection but simultaneously terrified of it. Most ominously, Dr. Hartogs warned that Lee's detachment and potential for explosive, aggressive acting out made him a potential danger to himself or others, recommending psychiatric treatment for both him and his mother. Marguerite, however, in her characteristic fashion, rejected the diagnosis, viewing it as an attack on her and her parenting. She refused to cooperate, and the recommended therapy never happened. Upon their return to New Orleans in 1954, Lee's academic and social struggles continued unabated. He drifted through various high schools, including Warren Easton High School, where his performance was mediocre. He was small for his age, unathletic, and possessed an air of intellectual superiority that did little to endear him to his peers. He read voraciously but indiscriminately, absorbing complex political and philosophical texts far beyond his years. Yet he lacked the emotional maturity or formal education to properly contextualize or understand them. It was during this period that his interest in Marxism began to solidify. He discovered the works of Karl Marx in the public library at the age of 15 and was immediately captivated. Here was a grand, all-encompassing theory that seemed to explain his own feelings of alienation and oppression. It provided a framework for his personal grievances, transforming his sense of failure into a righteous indignation against a corrupt capitalist system. He began to see himself not as a troubled teenager, but as a revolutionary in waiting, a man of ideas who was intellectually superior to the sheep around him. This newfound ideological fervor provided a purpose but also deepened his isolation. He had no one with whom to share his burgeoning political beliefs. His classmates were interested in sports and dating, not the dialectical materialism he was attempting to master. He tried to engage his older brother, Robert, who had joined the Marines, in political debate, but his letters were met with bemusement and concern rather than intellectual engagement. His ideology became a fortress, a place to which he could retreat and feel superior. It was a defense mechanism against a world that had consistently rejected him. By the time he dropped out of high school for the final time in October 1956, just a few days after his 17th birthday, the die was cast. He was a young man adrift, armed with a half-baked political philosophy and a lifetime of resentment. His next move was both a desperate attempt to find structure and a paradoxical step for a self-proclaimed Marxist. He would follow in his brother's footsteps and enlist in the United States Marine Corps. Part 3. The Marine. Discipline and Dogma on October 24, 1956. Just 1 week after his 17th birthday and with his mother's begrudging consent, Lee Harvey Oswald enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. This decision was a bundle of contradictions. For a budding Marxist who disdained American imperialism, joining its most formidable fighting force seemed a bizarre choice. Yet, for a young man whose life had been defined by chaos and a lack of paternal guidance, the Corps offered the promise of rigid structure, discipline, and a clear sense of identity. It was also an escape from the suffocating orbit of his mother and the cycle of failure that had marked his civilian life. Perhaps he imagined himself as a revolutionary infiltrating the system from within. Or maybe, on a simpler level, he was just a lost boy seeking the order he had never known. Whatever his motivation, Private Oswald was sent to the Marine Corps Recruit Depot in San Diego for boot camp, a crucible designed to strip away individuality and forge a Marine. Initially, Oswald seemed to adapt. He completed basic training and was sent to the Naval Air Technical Training Center in Jacksonville, Florida, for aviation electronics school. His test scores were respectable, particularly in areas requiring technical aptitude. He was trained as an aviation radar operator, a position that required precision and attention to detail. In 1957, he was assigned to Marine Air Control Squadron 1 MAX-1 at the Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California, before being deployed to Naval Air Facility Atsugi in Japan. This was a highly sensitive posting. Atsugi was a major base for U-2 spy plane operations over the Soviet Union and China. As a radar operator, Oswald held a security clearance and was privy to classified information regarding the altitude, speed, and flight paths of these secret missions. For a time, it seemed the discipline of the military might provide the framework he so desperately needed. He qualified as a sharpshooter on the rifle range, a standard but respectable achievement, though he was not considered an exceptional marksman by his peers. However, the core of Oswald's personality, his ingrained resentment of authority, his intellectual arrogance, and his profound social alienation could not be erased by military discipline. It wasn't long before his sullen, combative nature began to surface. He was not a popular Marine. His comrades nicknamed him Aussie Rabbit, and often ridiculed him for his intellectual pretensions and his burgeoning pro-Soviet sentiments. He spent his off-duty hours not drinking and carousing with his fellow Marines, but alone, practicing his rudimentary Russian and reading political literature. He began to openly express his Marxist views, which were met with a mixture of derision and suspicion. His superiors noted his insubordination and poor attitude. The veneer of the disciplined Marine was cracking, revealing the malcontent underneath. His service record, once promising, began to accumulate infractions. He was court-martialed on 2 separate occasions in 1958. The first was for illegally possessing an unregistered private handgun. The second, and more serious charge came after he provoked a fight with a sergeant he believed was responsible for his punishment in the first court-martial, resulting in a stint in the brig. These disciplinary actions solidified Oswald's view of the military, and by extension, the United States, as an oppressive and unjust system. His disillusionment was total. The structure he had sought had become a prison, and the authority he had hoped would guide him had become his tormentor. By late 1958, he had made a fateful decision. He would defect to the Soviet Union. This was the ultimate act of rebellion, a complete and total rejection of the country of his birth. He applied for and received a dependency discharge from the Marine Corps in September 1959. Falsely claiming he needed to care for his ailing mother, he had saved a modest amount of money from his Marine pay, and with this small nest egg, he booked passage on a freighter from New Orleans to Le Havre, France, and then made his way to Helsinki, Finland. On October 16, 1959, just 2 days before his 20th birthday, Harvey Oswald arrived at the Hotel Tourney in Helsinki and applied at the Soviet consulate for a visa. He was about to trade one form of perceived oppression for another, driven by a deeply flawed and romanticized vision of the workers' paradise he believed awaited him. Part 4. The Defector. An American in Minsk. Upon arriving in Moscow on October 16, 1959, carrying his Marine Corps discharge papers and a head full of Marxist theory, Harvey Oswald was brimming with a sense of historical self-importance. He immediately declared to his tourist guide his intention to renounce his American citizenship and become a citizen of the Soviet Union. This was the grand gesture he had been building towards, the ultimate repudiation of the society he felt had rejected him. He envisioned a hero's welcome, imagining himself being embraced as a politically enlightened individual who had seen through the facade of American capitalism. The Soviets, however, were not so easily impressed. They were deeply suspicious. Why would a former US Marine with a security clearance suddenly want to defect? Was he a spy, a provocateur, or simply an unstable individual? His initial interviews with Soviet officials were tense and inconclusive. They saw not a committed communist hero, but a volatile and emotionally immature young man whose knowledge of Marxism was superficial at best. His grand plans quickly collided with the rigid wall of Soviet bureaucracy. After several days of waiting, he was informed that his request for citizenship was being denied and that his tourist visa would expire shortly, meaning he would have to leave the country. For Oswald, this was a devastating blow, a rejection from the very system he had idealized. It was a replay of the lifelong pattern of being rebuffed and deemed unworthy. In a moment of high drama and desperation, on October 21, 1959, in his room at the Metropole Hotel, he slashed his left wrist in a theatrical but ultimately non-lethal suicide attempt. He was discovered by his tourist guide and rushed to a Moscow hospital, where he was placed in the psychiatric ward. This act, born of despair, ironically achieved what his political declarations could not. It convinced the Soviet authorities that sending him back to the United States might create an embarrassing international incident. They could not risk the propaganda coup the Americans would score if a would-be defector committed suicide upon being returned. Reluctantly, they decided to let him stay, rather than granting him the Moscow residency he coveted, a privilege reserved for the well-connected. The Soviets shipped him off to Minsk, the capital of the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic. It was a provincial city, clean and orderly, still rebuilding from the devastation of World War II. For the Soviets, it was the perfect place to park their peculiar American problem. In Minsk, he could be easily monitored by the KGB, and his potential for causing trouble would be minimized. Oswald was given a job at the Gorizont Horizon Electronics Factory, a plant that produced radios and televisions. He was provided with a small but comfortable, fully furnished, subsidized studio apartment in a prestigious building, a luxury beyond the reach of most Soviet citizens. He was also given a generous monthly stipend from the Red Cross, intended to supplement his factory wages and ensure he lived at a standard far above that of the average worker. For a brief period, Oswald's life was better than it had ever been. He had a steady job, a nice home, and financial security. all provided by the state he professed to admire. Yet, the initial novelty soon wore off, replaced by a creeping disillusionment. The reality of Soviet life was a far cry from the vibrant, revolutionary society he had imagined. He found the work at the factory mind-numbingly tedious and his co-workers unsophisticated. He complained in his diary about the lack of consumer goods, the bland food, and the intellectual emptiness of his surroundings. There were no spontaneous political debates, no thriving revolutionary culture, only the drab reality of a conformist and authoritarian society. He was an object of curiosity, the lone American in Minsk, but he remained an outsider. He had traded one form of alienation for another. He had fantasized about being a protagonist in a grand historical drama, but in Minsk, he was merely a curiosity, a minor character in a play he didn't understand. The grand ideological quest had led to a dead end. The workers' paradise, he discovered, was just as flawed and, in many ways, more oppressive than the world he had left behind. His diary entries from this period reflect a growing boredom, frustration, and a sense of being trapped. The great escape had failed, and soon, Harvey Oswald would begin plotting his next move. A return to the very country he had so dramatically abandoned. Part 5. A Soviet Interlude. Love and disillusionment. Life in Minsk settled into a monotonous routine for Harvey Oswald. The initial sense of being a special case, the American who had chosen communism, quickly faded into the gray reality of everyday Soviet existence. While his state-subsidized apartment and Red Cross allowance afforded him a comfortable life by local standards, he was profoundly bored. The work at the Horizon Electronics factory was repetitive and unchallenging for a man who, despite his lack of formal education, considered himself an intellectual. He looked down on his co-workers, viewing their conversations about family, sports, and local gossip as trivial. In his diary, he lamented the lack of intellectual stimulation and the absence of the revolutionary fervor he had expected to find. He was an oddity, a man suspended between two worlds, belonging to neither. He had rejected America, but the Soviet Union had not truly accepted him. It had merely warehoused him in a provincial city where he could be observed and controlled. It was against this backdrop of ennui and isolation that he sought social connection. In the evenings he would attend state-sponsored dances and social events, places where young people gathered under the watchful eye of the states. It was at a trade union dance in March 1961 that he met Marina Nikolaevna Pusakova. She was a 19-year-old pharmacology student at a local institute, a pretty, vivacious young woman who was immediately intrigued by the brooding American. Unlike the other men she knew, Oswald was worldly, mysterious, and spoke with a captivating foreign accent. For Oswald, Marina represented a connection to the society around him, a potential cure for his loneliness. He was smitten, and after a whirlwind courtship of just 6 weeks, they were married on April 30, 1961. The marriage was a swift, impulsive decision, characteristic of Oswald's personality, a desperate grasp at normalcy and belonging in a life that had been anything but. The early days of their marriage were, by all accounts, relatively happy. Marina moved into Oswald's comfortable apartment, and for a time, he seemed content. He had a wife, a home, and a semblance of a normal life. Marina was impressed by his apparent intelligence and his stories of America, a land that seemed impossibly glamorous from the vantage point of Minsk. However, the fundamental instability of Oswald's character soon began to strain the relationship. His moods were volatile, swinging from periods of affection to sullen withdrawal and fits of rage. He was possessive and controlling, attempting to mold Marina into his ideal of a wife. He insisted she learn English and tried to indoctrinate her with his muddled political views. He was critical of her friends and her family, further isolating the young couple. The man she had seen as a sophisticated foreigner was revealing himself to be an insecure and abusive husband by the end of 1961. Oswald had made another momentous decision. He wanted to go home. His disillusionment with the Soviet Union was complete. The initial promise of a socialist utopia had given way to the tedious reality of a bureaucratic authoritarian state. He wrote to the US Embassy in Moscow, which he had visited during his initial defection attempt to renounce his citizenship, now petitioning to have his American passport returned. He declared that his time in the Soviet Union had reaffirmed his belief in the superiority of the American way of life. The process was fraught with bureaucratic hurdles from both the American and Soviet sides. The Soviets, who had never fully trusted him, were now suspicious of his desire to leave, while the Americans were wary of the former defector. The birth of their daughter, June Lee Oswald, in February 1962, added a new layer of complexity and urgency. After months of paperwork, interviews, and uncertainty, the Oswalds were finally granted permission to leave. In late May 1962, the US State Department, in a move that would later be heavily scrutinized, provided Oswald with a loan to cover the travel expenses for himself, his wife, and his infant daughter. On June 1, 1962, the small family boarded a train out of Minsk, leaving the Soviet experiment behind for the uncertain future that awaited them back in the United States. Part 6. Return to America. A marriage understrained the return to the United States. In June 1962 was not a triumphant homecoming for Harvey Oswald. He arrived not as a prodigal son but as a failure, a man who had gambled on a grand ideological gesture and lost. The family settled first in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, moving in briefly with Lee's brother, Robert. The reunion was tense. Robert and his family were wary of the former defector and his Russian wife, and Lee's arrogant and argumentative nature quickly caused friction. Stripped of the artificial status he had enjoyed in Minsk, Oswald was once again just another face in the crowd. A high school dropout with a spotty work history and a heavy chip on his shoulder, he struggled to find and keep a job, bouncing between low-wage positions as a sheet metal worker and in photo printing shops. His resentment grew with each perceived slight and every menial task. He was forced to perform. The primary casualty of this period was his marriage to Marina. In America, away from her family and culture, Marina was completely dependent on her husband, a situation Oswald exploited. The controlling tendencies he had exhibited in Minsk escalated into outright physical and emotional abuse. He forbade her from learning English too quickly. Seeking to maintain his role as her sole interpreter and link to the outside world, he dictated what she could wear, whom she could see, and how she should behave. When she displeased him, he would often strike her. He was a domestic tyrant, recreating in his own home the kind of oppressive system he claimed to despise in the wider world. The dream of a new life in America had turned into a nightmare for Marina, who found herself isolated, terrified, and trapped in a volatile and violent marriage. She was a stranger in a strange land, married to a man whose inner demons were becoming increasingly uncontrollable. Amidst this personal turmoil, Oswald's political activities took on a new, more concrete form. He subscribed to various political publications, including The Militant, a communist newspaper, and began to correspond with political organizations. He was no longer just a passive reader of Marx. He was attempting to engage, to find a place for himself in the landscape of American radicalism. He saw himself as a political intellectual and began to write a manuscript about his time in the Soviet Union, a rambling, self-important tract he titled The Collective. He also began to order weapons through the mail. In January 1963, using his own name, he purchased a .38 Smith & Wesson revolver. 2 months later, in March, using the alias A. Hidell, he ordered a 6.5 x 5.2 Carcano rifle from a mail-order house in Chicago. This was the Italian military surplus rifle that would later be found on the 6th floor of the Texas schoolbook depository. The acquisition of these weapons marked a sinister shift from theoretical agitation to preparing for tangible violence. The spring of 1963 saw the family's life continue its downward spiral. Oswald lost yet another job, this time at a photography firm, after clashes with co-workers and superiors. The financial strain and his personal frustrations intensified the abuse Marina suffered. He was a man whose sense of self-worth was plummeting, and he compensated by asserting absolute power over his wife. It was in this toxic environment of personal failure, domestic tyranny, and escalating political fantasy that Oswald began to conceive of a new grand gesture. He needed a target, an enemy upon whom he could project his rage and assert the historical significance that he felt was his due. He was no longer content to simply argue politics or write manifestos. He had a rifle, a pistol, and a burning desire to make his mark on a world he believed had wronged him at every turn. His focus began to narrow, searching for a symbol of the political forces he had come to hate. Part 7. The Political Agitator. Fair play for Cuba. In late April 1963, Lee Harvey Oswald left Dallas for New Orleans, the city of his birth. He instructed a pregnant Marina to tell anyone who asked that he had gone to find work. His true purpose, however, was to reinvent himself once again, this time as a political activist. New Orleans, with its vibrant, chaotic energy and transient population, was the perfect stage for the next act in his personal drama. Upon arrival, he secured a menial job as a machinery oiler for the Reilly Coffee Company, a position he, of course, found beneath him. But the job was merely a means to an end. His real focus was on launching his own one-man political movement. He ordered 1,000 leaflets printed with the headline "Hands Off Cuba" and established a fictitious New Orleans chapter of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, FPCC, a pro-Castro organization that had a national presence but no actual branch in the city. Oswald named himself the chapter's secretary and used a rented post office box as its official address. His activism was more performance than substance. On several occasions in June and July, he stood on the streets of downtown New Orleans, handing out his pro-Castro leaflets to uninterested passers-by. This was his vision of revolutionary action, a solitary figure challenging the indifference of the masses. The public response was negligible. Most people ignored him. A few engaged in brief, dismissive arguments. His efforts were amateurish and largely ineffective, yet for Oswald, they were deeply meaningful. He was finally acting on his political beliefs, creating a public persona as a dedicated Marxist and a defender of the Cuban Revolution. He even wrote to the national headquarters of the FPCC in New York, exaggerating his activities and claiming to have established a thriving local chapter, a fantasy that existed only in his mind and in the post office box he rented under the chapter's name. His street-level agitation inevitably led to conflict. In early August, he encountered a group of anti-Castro Cuban exiles, led by Carlos Bringuier, who was staunch opponents of the communist regime. Oswald deliberately approached Bringuier pretending to be a sympathizer and offering to help in their fight against Castro. A few days later, Bringuier saw Oswald on the street handing out his pro-Castro FPCC leaflets and realized he had been deceived. A confrontation ensued, drawing a crowd and the attention of the police. Oswald was arrested, along with Bringuier and 2 of his associates, for disturbing the peace. Oswald, ever the martyr, was thrilled. He spent a night in jail and, upon his release, contacted the local radio and television stations, eager to publicize his story. This incident culminated in Oswald's most significant moment of public exposure prior to the assassination. He was invited to participate in a radio debate on WDSU's Latin American Focus program. During the broadcast on August 17, 1963, he was pitted against Carlos Bringuier and other anti-Castro commentators. For Oswald, this was the intellectual showdown he had always craved. However, the debate quickly turned into an His opponents came prepared. They revealed his 1959 defection to the Soviet Union and highlighted the inconsistencies in his story, painting him not as a principled political activist but as a confused and hypocritical communist sympathizer. Oswald was flustered and defensive, unable to effectively counter their arguments. The public unmasking was a humiliating defeat. His attempt to build a reputation as a serious political figure in New Orleans had ended in failure and ridicule. Shortly thereafter, he was fired from the Reilly Coffee Company. His New Orleans experiment was over. By late September, a defeated and dejected Lee Harvey Oswald would take a bus to Mexico City in a last-ditch frantic effort to secure a visa to travel to Cuba, an effort that would also end in failure. Part 8. Prelude to a Tragedy. The Walker attempt. Long before the world knew his name in connection with the assassination of a president, Lee Harvey Oswald was already a political extremist willing to use violence to achieve his ends. The clearest and most chilling evidence of this was his attempted murder of retired Major General Edwin A. Walker in the spring of 1963. General Walker was a prominent and controversial figure on the far right of American politics. An ardent anti-communist and segregationist, Walker had been forced to resign from the U.S. Army. After it was discovered he was indoctrinating his troops with right-wing political literature from the John Birch Society. After his resignation, he settled in Dallas and became a vocal and polarizing public figure, a symbol of the reactionary political forces that Oswald, from his own opposing ideological extreme, had come to despise. In the weeks leading up to the attempt, Oswald's behavior became increasingly secretive and purposeful. This was not an impulsive act, it was a premeditated plan. Using his alias Ahidel, the same name he had used to order his rifle, he began to meticulously plan the assassination. He used his mail-order photography equipment to take pictures of General Walker's stately home on Turtle Creek Boulevard in Dallas. He studied maps of the area, charting out approach and escape routes. He posed for what would become a series of infamous backyard photographs, holding his newly acquired Carcano rifle, and the pistol he had also purchased by mail, along with copies of the Marxist newspapers he read. In one of these photos, he is seen holding the rifle aloft in a triumphant, revolutionary pose. These were not just idle pictures, they were a form of self-mythologizing, a man casting himself in the role of a political assassin before the fact. He was documenting his own radicalization, creating a record of his intent. On the evening of April 10, 1963, Oswald put his plan into action. He left a note in Russian for his wife, Marina, telling her what to do if he did not return. He then took a bus to the vicinity of Walker's house, carrying his Carcano rifle. He found a position in the alleyway behind the home and waited. Walker was in his dining room, working on his tax returns, visible through a large, well-lit window. From a distance of just over 100 feet, Oswald aimed and fired a single shot. The bullet struck the wooden frame of the window, sending splinters and fragments of lead into the room. One fragment struck Walker in the forearm, but he was not seriously injured. The force of the bullet had been deflected by the window frame. Walker, startled but largely unharmed, was initially unsure of what had happened. Oswald, believing he had either missed or only wounded his target, melted back into the night, hiding the rifle and making his way home on foot. At the time, the Dallas police had no suspects. The bullet was too badly damaged for definitive ballistic identification. The crime remained unsolved. Oswald had gotten away with it. The significance of this event cannot be overstated. It was a dress rehearsal for the tragedy that would unfold in Dallas 7 months later. It demonstrated that Oswald was not merely a political theorist or a street corner agitator. He was a cold-blooded, calculating individual capable of attempting to murder someone for purely ideological reasons. He had crossed the line from fantasy to action. Marina Oswald would later testify that upon his return that night, Lee had admitted to her what he had done, confessing that he had shot at General Walker. The failure of the attempt did not deter him. If anything, it may have emboldened him. He had proven to himself that he could plan and execute such an act. The only thing that had failed was the result. The next time, he would choose a more prominent target and a better vantage point. Part 9. The Dallas Drifter, The Path to the Depository. After the humiliating failure of his political ambitions in New Orleans and his desperate, unsuccessful trip to Mexico City in late September 1963 to obtain a visa for Cuba, Lee Harvey Oswald returned to Dallas in early October, a man adrift. He was 23 years old, unemployed, with a pregnant wife and a young daughter he could not support. His grand dreams of becoming a revolutionary figure had crumbled into dust. He was, by any objective measure, a complete failure. He initially stayed at his brother Robert's home, but his presence was a source of constant tension. He soon moved into a small rooming house in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas, living under the name O.H. Lee, yet another alias in a life full of them. He saw his family, who were living with a friend of Marina's, Ruth Payne, only on weekends. This separation further frayed his already tattered marriage and deepened his sense of isolation. It was Ruth Payne who, in an act of kindness that would have devastating historical consequences, unwittingly set the stage for the coming tragedy. Hearing that Oswald was looking for work, she mentioned that a neighbor's brother, Buell Wesley Frazier, worked at the Texas School Book Depository in downtown Dallas and had heard they were hiring temporary workers for the busy Christmas season. On October 15, 1963, Oswald applied for a position and, the following day, he began work as an order filler, earning $1.25 an hour. The six-story brick building, located at the corner of Elm and Houston Streets, offered a commanding view of Dealey Plaza. For Oswald, it was just another menial job, another symbol of his lowly status. But from the windows of its upper floors, one could watch the world go by, including the planned route of a presidential motorcade. During the week, Oswald lived his solitary life in the Oak Cliff rooming house. He was a quiet, unremarkable tenant who kept to himself. On the weekends, he would visit Marina and his daughter June at the Payne household in the suburb of Irving. These visits were often fraught with conflict. He and Marina argued constantly, their disputes fueled by his failures, his controlling nature, and their dire financial situation. On the weekend before the assassination, they had a particularly bitter fight. Marina was growing increasingly independent, learning English from Ruth Payne and making friends. This enraged Oswald, who saw his control over her slipping away. He was losing his grip on the one part of his life where he had been able to exert absolute power. His personal world was collapsing just as his political frustrations were reaching a boiling point. On the morning of Thursday, November 21st, the day before the assassination, Oswald took the unusual step of making a midweek visit to the Payne house. He rode home to Irving with his co-worker Buell Wesley Frazier, a daily routine he normally reserved for Fridays. That evening, he tried to reconcile with Marina, but she rebuffed him. He was tense and agitated. Before going to bed, he placed his wedding ring in a small cup on Marina's bedside table, along with most of the cash he had in his wallet. It was a gesture of finality, a symbolic severing of his last remaining ties. In the garage of the Payne's home, wrapped in a blanket, lay his Carcano rifle, which he had retrieved from its hiding place. The next morning, he would wrap the disassembled rifle in brown paper and tell Frazier that the package contained curtain rods. The path to the Texas School Book Depository was now set. A failed revolutionary, a failed husband, and a failed man was about to seize his own twisted version of historical immortality. Part 10. The morning of November 22nd. The calm before the morning of Friday, November 22nd, 1963, dawned cool and rainy in Dallas, though the forecast promised clearing skies by midday. In the quiet suburb of Irving, Lee Harvey Oswald rose early. He dressed for work in his usual clothes but moved with a singular purpose. The night before, after a failed attempt at reconciliation with Marina, he had placed his wedding ring and the bulk of his cash on her dresser, a silent act of departure. His most important preparation had been done in the garage of the Payne's home, where he had retrieved his 6.5mm Mannlicher Carcano rifle. He wrapped the disassembled weapon in a length of brown craft paper, securing it with tape, creating a clumsy, elongated package. It was this package that would become a key piece of evidence, a tangible link in the chain of events leading to the assassination. His co-worker Buell Wesley Frazier, who drove Oswald from Irving to the Texas School Book Depository each workday, noticed the package when Oswald got into his car. "What's in the package?" Lee Frazier asked casually. "Curtain rods," Oswald replied without hesitation. The lie was simple and mundane, easily accepted. During the drive into Dallas, Oswald was unusually quiet, even for him. He stared out the window as the suburban landscape gave way to the city streets. He was carrying a weapon of war, on his way to a place that would soon become infamous, yet his outward demeanor was one of calm detachment. He was a man on a mission, his mind focused on the task ahead, the culmination of a lifetime of failure, resentment, and violent ideation. The curtain rod excuse was a flimsy shield, but it was enough to carry him and his weapon to their destination. They arrived at the Texas School Book Depository at the corner of Elm and Houston Streets shortly before 8 a.m. Oswald got out of the car, took his package, and walked ahead of Frazier toward the building. Frazier would later testify that Oswald walked with a determined stride, holding the package parallel to his body. Once inside, Oswald's movements become harder to trace with certainty. He was just one of dozens of employees beginning their workday. He went about his initial duties, filling orders for school textbooks, moving between the building's 7 floors. He was seen by several co-workers during the morning hours, none of whom noted anything particularly unusual about his behavior. He was the same sullen, quietly he had always been, but while his hands were busy with order forms and books, his mind was almost certainly on the main event of the day. The arrival of President John F. Kennedy's motorcade, which was scheduled to pass directly in front of the building around 12:30 p.m. as the morning wore on. Other employees began to gather by the windows, anticipating the festive occasion of the presidential visit. The atmosphere was one of excitement and anticipation, but Oswald was not among them. Sometime before noon, he made his way to the 6th floor. This floor was undergoing renovations, with some of the flooring being replaced. Boxes of books were stacked high throughout the vast, open space, creating a maze of potential hiding places. In the southeast corner of the floor, overlooking Dealey Plaza, Oswald found the perfect spot. He began to construct what would later be called the sniper's nest. He moved several heavy boxes of books, arranging them to create a 3-sided shield that would hide him from anyone else on the floor. He also arranged a box to serve as a makeshift rifle rest, ensuring a stable platform for his aim. From this perch, he had a clear, unobstructed view of Elm Street, the exact path the president's limousine would take after making the sharp turn from Houston Street. The stage was now set. The calm before the storm was about to end. Part 11. From the 6th floor. The assassins perched by midday. The rain had stopped and the sun had broken through the clouds, just as predicted. A festive, cheering crowd lined the streets of downtown Dallas, eagerly awaiting the arrival of President John F. Kennedy and his wife, Jacqueline. Inside the Texas School Book Depository, most of the employees had gone downstairs or to the windows on lower floors to get a better view. The vast 6th floor, with its dusty wooden floors and towering stacks of textbooks, was deserted. It was here, in the southeast corner window, that Lee Harvey Oswald waited. His sniper's nest, meticulously constructed from cardboard boxes, shielded him from view and provided a stable rest for his Italian-made rifle. Through the grimy window pane, he had a perfect, elevated view of the intersection of Houston and Elm Streets, a kill zone of his own choosing. At approximately 12:30 p.m., the presidential motorcade made its slow, sharp left turn onto Elm Street, directly below Oswald's perch. The president's dark blue Lincoln convertible, its bubble top removed at Kennedy's request so he could better see the crowds, entered Dealey Plaza. In the car, Governor John Connally of Texas and his wife Nellie sat in the jump seats in front of the president and First Lady. As the limousine straightened out on Elm Street, Nellie Connally turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you." Kennedy smiled. It was at that moment that Oswald peered through the cheap 4X telescopic sight of his Carcano rifle, centered the crosshairs, and squeezed the trigger. The first shot rang out, a sharp crack that many in the crowd mistook for a firecracker or a motorcycle backfiring. This first bullet struck the president in the upper back, exited his throat, and then hit Governor Connally, who was sitting directly in front of him. Inflicting serious wounds, there was a pause of several seconds, a moment of confusion and dawning horror. The president's hands flew to his throat, a reflexive action to the bullet that had just passed through his neck. Governor Connally, his lung collapsed and a rib shattered, slumped into his wife's lap. Then came the second shot from Oswald's rifle. This was the one that missed its mark entirely, striking the curb on the south side of Elm Street and sending a fragment of concrete flying, which slightly injured a bystander named James Togg. The final fatal shot came approximately 5 seconds after the first. This bullet struck President Kennedy in the back of the head, causing a massive and catastrophic wound. The horrific moment was captured on the 8mm home movie film of a dressmaker named Abraham Zapruder, becoming one of the most famous and closely analyzed pieces of film in history. The president's body slumped to the left, into the arms of his wife, as the limousine, now a scene of unimaginable horror, sped away towards Parkland Memorial Hospital. In the sniper's nest, the deed was done. Oswald had fired 3 shots in approximately 8 seconds, a feat that firearms experts would later determine was difficult but entirely possible with the bolt-action Carcano rifle. Having irrevocably altered the course of American history, his thoughts turned to escape. He left the rifle wedged between some boxes near the window, a location where it would be quickly discovered by police. He also left behind 3 spent 6.5mm shell casings, littering the floor of his perch. These casings, along with the rifle itself, would become the core of the physical evidence linking him to the crime. With calm and deliberate speed, he crossed the 6th floor and made his way to the back staircase. His moment of historical infamy had been achieved. Now he had to try and melt back into the anonymity from which he had come. Part 12, Flight and Capture. The manhunt in the chaotic moments immediately following the shots in Dealey Plaza. As the presidential limousine sped towards Parkland Hospital, Lee Harvey Oswald was already making his escape. He quickly stashed his rifle behind a stack of boxes on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository and descended via the rear staircase. On the 2nd floor, he encountered Marion Baker, a Dallas police motorcycle outrider who had rushed into the building, and Roy Truly, the building's superintendent. Truly identified Oswald as an employee, and Baker, seeing nothing suspicious about the quiet man, let him pass. Oswald then walked calmly into the 2nd floor lunchroom, purchased a Coca-Cola from a vending machine, and walked out the front entrance of the building just minutes after the assassination. While a dragnet was beginning to close around Delhi Plaza, the lone assassin simply walked away from the scene. Oswald's movements over the next hour were a frantic but purposeful attempt to put distance between himself and the crime. He walked several blocks east before boarding a city bus. However, the bus quickly became stuck in the gridlocked traffic that had paralyzed downtown Dallas in the wake of the assassination. Realizing the bus was too slow, he got off after a few blocks and hailed a taxi. He directed the driver to take him to his rooming house in the Oak Cliff neighborhood, a residential area several miles away. He arrived at the house at approximately 1 p.m., startling the housekeeper, Erlene Roberts. He went straight to his small room, stayed for only a few minutes, and then left again on foot. Roberts would later notice that he had changed his shirt and was now wearing a jacket. He had also armed himself with the .38 revolver he had purchased by mail order earlier that year. By this time, a description of the assassination suspect, based on eyewitness accounts from Delhi Plaza, was being broadcast over the Dallas police radio. The description was Vega white, male, slender, in his early 30s, but it was enough to put every officer in the city on high alert. At approximately 1:15 p.m., Dallas police officer J.D. Tippett was patrolling the streets of Oak Cliff when he spotted a man walking who matched the general description. Tippett pulled his patrol car alongside Oswald and called him over. What happened next was witnessed by several people in the quiet residential neighborhood. After a brief exchange through the car window, Oswald suddenly pulled out his revolver and fired several shots at Officer Tippett, killing him instantly. This was a desperate, panicked act. The murder of Tippett was not a political statement. It was the act of a fugitive trying to escape justice for his previous crime. He had now compounded the assassination of a president with the murder of a police officer. The Tippett murder created a new, more localized crime scene, and the police response was immediate and overwhelming. Witnesses provided a clear description of the shooter and his direction of flight. The manhunt, which had been spread across the city, now focused intensely on this small section of Oak Cliff. As police cars swarmed the area, Oswald was seen ducking into the Texas Theater, a local movie house, without paying. Ticket cashier, alerted by the commotion outside, called the police. Within minutes, the theater was surrounded. The lights were brought up, and police began to search the patrons. Oswald was found sitting in the rear of the theater. As officers approached, he shouted, "Well, it is all over now," and then attempted to draw his pistol. In the ensuing struggle, he was quickly overpowered and disarmed. At approximately 1:50 p.m., less than 90 minutes after he had fired the fatal shots at President Kennedy, Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested. Part 13. The Prisoner. 2 days of denial. Dragged from the darkness of the Texas Theater into the glare of the world's attention, Lee Harvey Oswald was thrust into the chaotic heart of the Dallas police headquarters. He was now the most famous and most hated man in America. As he was paraded through the crowded hallways, mobbed by a frantic scrum of reporters and photographers shouting questions, he began his defense. "I didn't shoot anybody," he yelled, his face a mask of defiant indignation. This would be his consistent, unwavering story for the next 2 days. Throughout more than 12 hours of interrogation, conducted by a rotating team of Dallas police detectives, FBI agents, and Secret Service officials, Oswald denied everything. He denied shooting President Kennedy. He denied shooting Officer J.D. Tippett. He denied owning a rifle. He denied it all. The interrogations were disjointed and poorly documented. No audio recordings were made, and no official stenographer was present, a critical failure that would later fuel endless speculation. The only records are the handwritten notes and subsequent reports of the officers who were present. According to these accounts, Oswald was cool, arrogant, and evasive. He calmly answered some questions while refusing to address others, sparring intellectually with his questioners. He lied repeatedly and without hesitation. He claimed the package he brought to work contained his lunch. He denied ever owning a rifle, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary, including the backyard photos of him posing with the cock. When confronted with the Ahadel alias under which the rifle was purchased, he offered no explanation. He portrayed himself as a victim, a patsy, as he famously declared during one of his impromptu hallway press conferences. He claimed he was being framed because he had lived in the Soviet Union and held unpopular political views, while Oswald was stonewalling his interrogators. The evidence against him was rapidly mounting into an insurmountable mountain. His palm print was found on the rifle discovered on the 6th floor. Fibers from his shirt matched fibers found in the sniper's nest. The rifle itself was traced back to the Chicago mail order house that had sent it to a post office box rented by Oswald. His co-workers confirmed he was present in the building that morning and that he was the only employee unaccounted for immediately after the shooting. Multiple witnesses positively identified him as the man who had shot Officer Tippit. The case against him was singed not by a single piece of evidence, but by the sheer, interlocking weight of it all. Yet, inside the interrogation room, Oswald remained steadfast in his alternate reality, a world in which he was an innocent man caught in a web of conspiracy. The 2 days he spent in custody were a media circus unprecedented in American history. The Dallas police, unequipped to handle a story of this magnitude, allowed reporters and photographers almost unfettered access to the building's hallways. Oswald was repeatedly paraded before the cameras as he was moved between his cell and the interrogation rooms. These brief, chaotic appearances were his only direct communication with the public. In these moments he appeared defiant, sometimes smirking, shouting his denials over the din. He requested legal representation from John Abt, a lawyer known for defending communists and left-wing causes, but was unable to reach him. This lack of legal counsel during his interrogation would become another point of contention for critics of the official investigation. He was a man alone, surrounded by his accusers, playing the role of the persecuted political prisoner he had perhaps always imagined himself to be, right up until his final, fateful transfer. Part 14. A Shot in the Basement. The Silencing. By Sunday morning, November 24, 1963, the Dallas Police Department had made the decision to transfer Lee Harvey Oswald from their downtown headquarters to the more secure county jail. The plan was announced to the press, a decision that transformed a routine prisoner transfer into a live media event. Despite the fact that Oswald was the most notorious accused assassin in modern history, and despite numerous threats being called into the police station, security for the transfer was shockingly lax. The Dallas police, perhaps seeking to redeem themselves after the security failures of the assassination itself, opted for a public spectacle rather than a discreet, secure move. They decided to transport Oswald via the basement parking garage, which was swarming with reporters, photographers, and television crews who had been allowed to congregate there shortly after 11:15 a.m. Oswald, handcuffed to a Dallas detective, was led out towards an unmarked police car. He was wearing a dark sweater, his expression a familiar mix of defiance and apprehension. As he stepped into the glare of the television lights, a portly figure suddenly lunged forward from the crowd of reporters. It was Jack Ruby, a local nightclub owner with ties to the Dallas underworld and a known police buff who had been seen around the headquarters throughout the chaotic weekend. In his hand, Ruby held a .38 Colt Cobra revolver. He pushed the gun into Oswald's abdomen and fired a single shot. The flash of the pistol was captured live on national television, a moment of shocking violence broadcast directly into the homes of a nation already reeling from the president's murder. Oswald cried out in pain and collapsed to the concrete floor, mortally wounded. The scene erupted into chaos. Police officers swarmed Ruby, wrestling him to the ground and disarming him. Detectives bundled the dying Oswald into an ambulance that had been waiting for the transfer. He was rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, the very same hospital where President Kennedy had been pronounced dead just 2 days earlier. Doctors worked frantically to save him, but the single bullet had torn through his vital organs. Lee Harvey Oswald was pronounced dead at 1:07 p.m. The man who had silenced the president had himself been silenced before he could ever stand trial, before the nation could hear his full story or see the evidence against him presented in a court of law. The murder of Lee Harvey Oswald was a pivotal and catastrophic event. It denied the American public the legal and emotional closure of a trial. It prevented the full weight of the evidence from being subjected to the adversarial process of a courtroom, where it could be challenged and cross-examined. For a nation desperate for answers and clarity, Oswald's death created a permanent void. It was this void that would become the fertile ground for the explosion of conspiracy theories that would follow. Jack Ruby's motives would be debated for decades. He claimed he acted out of a grief-stricken patriotic rage, wanting to spare Jacqueline Kennedy the ordeal of returning to Dallas for a trial. Others would speculate that Ruby was part of a larger conspiracy, tasked with silencing Oswald to prevent him from revealing the names of his co-conspirators. Whatever his true motivation, Jack Ruby's impulsive act of violence in the basement of the Dallas police headquarters ensured that the assassination of John F. Kennedy would not be an open and shut case, but rather an enduring and deeply divisive national mystery. Part 15. The Enduring Enigma. Legacy and Conspiracy. The death of Lee Harvey Oswald at the hands of Jack Ruby cemented the assassination of President John F. Kennedy not as a closed chapter of history, but as an open wound, a perpetual source of suspicion and debate. The fact that the accused assassin was murdered on live television before he could be tried created a vacuum of certainty that was quickly filled by a torrent of conspiracy theories. The American public, already struggling to comprehend how a figure as vibrant and powerful as Kennedy could be struck down, found it nearly impossible to accept that the act was perpetrated by a lone, disaffected loser like Oswald. The sheer magnitude of the event seemed to demand a more substantial cause, a more powerful and sinister force than a single man with a mail-order rifle. This fundamental disconnect between the cause and the effect became the engine of decades of doubt. In an attempt to quell the rising tide of speculation and provide definitive answers, President Lyndon B. Johnson established the President's Commission on the Assassination of President Kennedy, better known as the Warren Commission, named after its chairman, Supreme Court Chief Justice Earl Warren. After a 10-month investigation, the commission published its final 888-page report in September 1964. Its primary conclusions were unequivocal. Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, had fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, killing President Kennedy and wounding Governor Connally. The commission also concluded that Jack Ruby, acting alone, had murdered Oswald. It found no credible evidence of any conspiracy, domestic or foreign. For the U.S. government and for a significant portion of the scholarly community, the case was officially closed. The Warren Report was intended to be the final word for a vast segment of the public. However, the Warren Report was anything but the final word. It was seen by many as a whitewash, a government-sponsored effort to cover up a darker truth. Critics pointed to perceived flaws, inconsistencies, and unanswered questions in the commission's investigation. They questioned the single bullet theory, which posited that one bullet caused 7 wounds in both Kennedy and Connally. They pointed to the convenient silencing of Oswald, the murky connections of Jack Ruby, and the initial confusion among witnesses in Dealey Plaza, some of whom believed shots had come from the grassy knoll in front of the motorcade. A cottage industry of books, articles, and documentaries emerged, each proposing alternative scenarios involving a wide array of potential conspirators: the Mafia, anti-Castro Cuban exiles, the CIA, the KGB, or even Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson himself. The persistence of these theories has been fueled by a deep-seated distrust in official institutions, a sentiment that grew throughout the turbulent 1960s and 70s with the Vietnam War and the Watergate scandal. The government's continued classification of thousands of documents related to the assassination, often citing national security concerns, has only deepened the suspicion for many. While numerous subsequent official investigations, including the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 1970s, have revisited the evidence, none have definitively overturned the Warren Commission's central finding that Oswald was the gunman. The House Committee, however, did conclude that there was a probable conspiracy, possibly involving a second gunman based on controversial acoustic evidence, though it still identified Oswald as the primary assassin. This ambiguous finding only added another layer to the enduring enigma. Ultimately, the legacy of Lee Harvey Oswald is that of a historical paradox, a man whose life of profound failure and insignificance culminated in an act of such monumental consequence that society has been struggling to make sense of it ever since. Thank you for joining us on this exhaustive journey into the life and actions of Lee Harvey Oswald. The events of that weekend in Dallas left a permanent mark on history, and the questions they raised still echo today. Subscribe for more historical deep dives and share your thoughts below.